Pope Francis travels today to Holguín, the second of 3 stops in Cuba. He celebrated Sunday Mass with thousands in Havana's Revolution Plaza. Susie Pinto reports from Havana tonight. Susie?
Pope Francis had a big weekend here in Havana. He said he came to this island nation as a missionary of mercy, and in true Francis style, he is reaching out to believers and non-believers alike. He met with Fidel Castro, Cuba's former leader. The meeting took place in Castro's home with his children and grandchildren. Pope Francis gave Fidel a book by a Catholic priest who was expelled from Cuba after the revolution. Before that historic meeting, Pope Francis followed in the footsteps of his predecessors John Paul II and Benedict XVI with a huge outdoor mass. Thousands of Cubans welcomed Pope Francis to Revolution Square in Havana. A massive banner of the Divine Mercy was put up for the Mass, a stark contrast to an image of Che Guevara, one of the founders of Cuba's communist and atheist revolution.
Todos estamos invitados, estimulados por Jesús.
Pope Francis asked Cubans to serve one another, saying, "We don't serve ideas or ideology, we serve people."
Gracias, Santo Padre, por haber favorecido el proceso de renovación en las relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos, que tanto beneficiará a nuestro pueblo.
Havana's Cardinal Jaime Ortega thanking the Holy Father for helping to normalize U.S.-Cuba relations, which he says will benefit Cubans. After Mass, Cuban President Raul Castro was the first to greet Pope Francis, followed by Argentina President Cristina Fernandez. Pope Francis just finished celebrating Mass in Revolution Square. It's a moment of great joy for Cuban Catholics. Now they're waiting to catch one more glimpse of him as he passes by in the Pope Mobile. Hope is the word we hear most when talking with people in the crowd. Hope for an end to the embargo, which this man calls cruel and unjust. Hope to keep serving Christ, which Cuba needs, according to this woman. And hope to spread the gospel without fear. Brian, the highlight of this trip has been talking to the Cuban people directly. They have been friendly, they have been open, and the message they're taking away from Pope Francis is a message of hope. Hope for the church and hope for the future of this nation.
Thank you. Susie Pinto in Havana tonight. Cuban security arrested 4 people who approached Pope Francis as he greeted crowds in Havana Sunday. 3 men and a woman ran toward the Pope at the iconic Jose Marti Monument near Revolution Square. Several of the men threw leaflets into the air. We're told they are human rights activists calling for an end to violence against those who oppose the Cuban government. Anna Quintana is a policy analyst for Latin American and Western Hemisphere at the Heritage Foundation. Anna, do you see Pope Francis playing a role similar to that of John Paul II when he returned to his native Poland in the late 70s? Can Francis get the Cuban people to rise up?
You know, I really hope he can, because his Mass yesterday and the Mass today was absolutely beautiful. And if you see the amount of people who attended, you know, Cuba is not the Cuban people, they're not traditionally religious, and I think it's a great thing for him to try to bring them back to Christ, and in doing so, kind of preaching those same human rights values that contradict the Cuban government, right? That contradict the Castro regime.
Well, we all saw the images of Fidel Castro, which puts the rumors that he's not around anymore, to sleep. He was with the Pope, Raul, his brother. Are the Castro brothers using this popular Pope, or is he on to their cunning?
You know, I think the Holy Father is intelligent enough, and I think he recognizes that that they are trying to use him in a way, but it appears as though the Cuban government is trying to use him against the American government, right? And kind of saying, I don't know if you noticed Cardinal Ortega saying, thank you for negotiating this U.S.-Cuba détente. Well, my question is, and my question has always been to the Catholic Church on the island, when is that détente going to happen between the Cuban government and the Cuban people, right? So this is kind of a great moment for the Cuban government to kind of use it as leverage against the United States government, but I don't think the Pope's going to let that happen.
Anna, what do you think needs to happen?
Simply put, the Cuban government needs to go away, right? The Cuban people need to be allowed to elect their own government. They need to elect a government that represents their values, that is going to promote and protect human rights, not a government that has slaughtered thousands of people simply for being Catholics. We remember Reagan's ambassador to the UN Human Rights Commission. He was in prison for over 20 years simply for being a Catholic. At the end of the day, communism is a godless ideology, and with that government system in place, there will never be religious freedom on the island.
We saw communism fall in the Eastern Bloc. I mean, Cuba's a little country. Can't it happen there?
I definitely think it can happen, but definitely not with the policy that the United States is pursuing. You know, Reagan never threw a lifeline, both economically and politically and morally, to these crumbling communist dictatorships, right? He allowed them to crumble. But what our president is doing is essentially throwing them a lifeline, saying, you know what, enough is enough. We're tired of being antagonistic towards you. We're just going to condone your military dictatorship.
A much different approach. Anna Quintana, the Heritage Foundation, thank you.
Thanks for having me.